Let me begin with a question that strikes at the heart of our moral lives. Can we be good without God? In today's world, this question has become increasingly urgent. We live in a time where many seek moral guidance outside the realm of religion, and ethics are often framed in purely human terms, absent of a transcendent moral lawgiver. Yet the question remains profound. If we reject God, how do we define goodness? Goodness is often taken for granted, but it is important to understand that what we consider good is tied to our worldview. If one believes in God, goodness is defined by the very nature of God. But in a secular society, goodness becomes something that can be shaped by the individual, society, or even cultural trends. In this context, I want us to examine the implications of this reality and whether true moral goodness can indeed be achieved outside of God. To understand goodness, we must first ask, what is the foundation of morality? For a society to function, there must be some shared understanding of right and wrong, an objective moral framework that transcends personal opinion. Without such a foundation, we are left with subjective morality, where what is good for one person may not be good for another. This raises a deeper issue. Is morality objective or subjective? If truth is subjective, if every person or culture has its own version of what is right and wrong, how can we say that some actions are universally evil, like murder, theft, or lying? If moral laws are not absolute, then we are left with chaos, where actions are justified purely based on individual or cultural preferences. I argue that objective moral laws must exist, and these laws cannot be rooted in human opinion. They must be grounded in something or someone transcendent, something unchanging. And that, for me, is God. Without an absolute standard for goodness, morality becomes inconsistent, unreliable, and ultimately arbitrary. Let us now consider the role of God in defining what is good. If we look to the Bible, we see that the understanding of goodness is inextricably linked to God Himself. The moral law is not arbitrary, it is a reflection of God's own nature. In Scripture, we are presented with clear guidelines for moral living, such as the Ten Commandments, which provide a framework for how we are to live with one another. These commandments are not just rules. They represent a moral order that aligns with the nature of a perfectly good God. God Himself is the standard of goodness, and His laws are a reflection of His own character. Without God, we are left to define goodness based on changing cultural trends or personal opinions. But true goodness, as I see it, can only be understood in relation to God, who is the source of all that is good and just. Now, consider the secular approach to defining ethics. Many believe that we can establish a moral system without God through human reason, social contracts, or cultural consensus. However, these secular attempts often fail to provide a solid foundation for morality. Took utilitarianism, for example, which advocates for the greatest good for the greatest number. While this idea may seem reasonable at first glance, it has some serious flaws. For one, it justifies actions that may harm individuals if they are deemed to be for the greater good. It doesn't offer protection for the weak or marginalized, and in some cases it could justify unethical acts like torture or oppression, provided they serve a supposed greater benefit. Similarly, moral relativism, the belief that what is morally right or wrong depends on cultural context or individual preference, creates a moral vacuum. If every culture and individual has their own set of moral standards, how can we address real evils like genocide or human trafficking? Moral relativism cannot provide the tools to judge these actions as objectively wrong. I argue that secular ethics, by their very nature, are inadequate. Without God, we are left with subjective standards, leading to a moral system that is fluid and inconsistent. If we are honest, we all experience a moral struggle. Every one of us knows what it feels like to want to do good, but to fall short of that ideal. Deep down, we recognize the difference between right and wrong. But we also experience the tension of failing to live up to our own moral standards. This struggle is not new. Throughout history, we see humanity wrestling with this duality, our desire for goodness and our propensity for evil. Sin, as I understand it, is the root cause of this conflict. Sin is not just about breaking rules. It is a rebellion against God's moral law, and it leads to the corruption of our moral compass. The reality is that all of us, at one time or another, have fallen short of what we know to be right. We may feel guilt or shame, but without a moral lawgiver, how can we make sense of these feelings? How can we address the wrongs we have done if there is no objective standard for what is right? In my view, sin keeps us from achieving true goodness, and without God, we are trapped in this cycle of moral failure. In the midst of this moral struggle, there is a solution: redemption through Christ. If we look at the story of the Bible, we see that God did not leave humanity in its moral depravity. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, God offers forgiveness and the power to live in accordance with his moral law. In our attempts at goodness are futile. We cannot on our own overcome the power of sin or restore our moral compass. But through Christ, we are given a new heart, a heart that desires to follow God and reflect his goodness. Through Christ's sacrifice on the cross, we receive grace, the unmerited favor of God, and with that grace comes the power to live out the goodness that he desires for us. This is not something we can achieve on our own. It is only through the work of God in our lives that we can be transformed, enabling us to live as true reflections of his goodness. Consider this: human beings, regardless of culture or background, recognize right and wrong. It is a universal experience. From the child who knows that stealing is wrong to the adult who feels guilt after a moral failure, all of us have an inherent understanding of moral truth. This universal recognition of moral law points to something beyond human culture, something transcendent. I would argue that this moral law is not something that humans invented or evolved. It is implanted in us by God himself. In the Bible, we are told that humanity was created in the image of God, which means that we are made to recognize and live according to God's moral order. Even those who do not acknowledge God still have this sense of right and wrong. This moral law, which transcends cultures and time periods, points to the reality that there is a moral lawgiver who has instilled this sense in humanity. Many people today argue that our sense of morality evolved over time as a social adaptation. The idea is that what we consider moral is simply a product of human evolution. something that helped our ancestors live together in harmony and pass on their genes. But I reject this idea. While human behavior may evolve in response to changing environments, moral laws cannot evolve in the same way. If morality is a product of evolution, then there is no solid foundation for determining what is truly right or wrong. What was once considered immoral could be redefined as acceptable depending on cultural changes or the whims of society. I believe that morality is not a social construct or an evolutionary byproduct. True moral standards must be anchored in something eternal and unchanging. For me, this anchor is God, who is the source of all that is good. The cross of Christ is the ultimate answer to the moral dilemma that humanity faces. Through the cross, God has provided a way for us to be forgiven for our failures and restored to a place of moral righteousness. The cross represents both God's justice and God's mercy. On the cross, Jesus bore the punishment for our sin, fulfilling the justice of God. At the same time, he offers mercy to all who believe, granting them forgiveness and the power to live according to God's moral law. It is through the cross that we are not only forgiven, but also empowered to live lives that reflect the goodness of God. Without the cross, we would be lost in our sin, with no hope of moral transformation. The challenge of goodness without God, as I conclude, let me leave you with this thought. Can we truly be good without God? I would argue that we cannot. Without God, goodness becomes subjective and moral standards become arbitrary. Only with God as the ultimate source of goodness can we truly understand and live out what it means to be good. The moral struggle that we all experience can only be overcome through the redemption that comes from God. Only in relationship with Him can we find the power to live morally upright lives and experience the fullness of true goodness.